Hello, my people, and welcome back to another great lecture on motivation. And we are focusing on hunger now. What do you mean hunger and motivation? They go together? Why, yes, they do. And let's find out why, shall we? All right, let's get going. So, what triggers hunger? Physically, we have stomach contractions, body chemistry, right? Hormones end up playing a role, which we'll find out. And the hypothalamus controls all of that, my friends. So our janitor plays a really big role when it comes to hunger, right? And maintaining balance in our body. So let's look at the physiology of hunger, right? So we have glucose, which is the form of sugar that circulates in our blood and provides a major source of energy, right? And we have two hormones that signal to our brain when we're hungry and when we're not. So glucose in our blood is how our body kind of sees how much energy we have, right? So when we eat, we start to get energy, and after we digest and our food goes away, right, our energy decreases until we get more food, right? So what they find is that there's orexigenic and anorexigenic. Interesting choice of words, right? If we look at the root word. So interesting, we'll keep that in your mind. So orexigenic signals to tell the brain to switch hunger on. It is a hormone that is signaled to the brain, right? That it turns our hunger on, okay? Anorexigenic signals to tell the brain to switch hunger off. Orexigenic open or on, or I would just think of like a big mouth opening to eat something. Anorexigenic to turn the hunger off. And if we both notice, there is also anorex in it, which also connects to anorexia, okay, which is what we're going to talk about, which is an eating disorder. So we have these two, right? And when let me move this. When our glucose level is too low, we feel hunger, and our stomach will trigger to say, ooh, it's starting to growl, and we're going to learn about how that connects in just a second, but that's how it triggers our hunger, right? So our desire to eat, right? So the lower our blood level, our blood glucose goes, the hungrier we get, and right when we eat, it starts to drop, so it tells our body that we no longer are hungry. So let's look at these 4 hormones that really affect our appetite, okay? So we have orexigenic, which is secreted by the hypothalamus, or not orexigenic, that was the full word. You can call it orexin. It's kind of like the shorter term. Orexin is secreted by the hypothalamus that triggers hunger, okay? Triggers hunger. It is then secreted by the stomach, right, and sends full signals to the brain. So, here, let me make sure I get all these. Here you go. Boop. And leptin. Okay, so we have the signal from the brain that triggers hunger, right? And then for this one, abstatine, I would like you to skip that one. This one, we don't need to know. We need to focus on ghrelin, insulin, and leptin, okay? So ghrelin is, here, let me move our little picture. Let me move my little picture here. Okay, so ghrelin is secreted by the empty stomach, and it sends hunger signals to the brain. So I always think of ghrelin it's growling. Your stomach is growling. So ghrelin is secreted by the empty stomach, which sends hunger signals to the brain. So when ghrelin is secreted, your stomach is growling. And then on the opposite side, after you get full, leptin is secreted by our fatty cells, and they signal to our brain that we are all done with food, and our drive starts to go away to eat. Okay, so ghrelin is what creates our stomach to growl, and leptin is what is our signal that we are no longer hungry. Okay, we do want to mention insulin, right? So people who have type 1 and type 2 diabetes, they have a hard time breaking down glucose, so they need insulin, which is usually secreted by our pancreas, and it controls our glucose levels. That is why people have to have insulin, because it helps them digest their food. And we don't need to know PPY. Sorry, PPY was from an older slide. So again, the most important parts is orexin, ghrelin, and leptin. Okay. So now that we've talked about, the physiological side, oh, and real quick, this is a really fun chart. You don't have to write anything down, but it's interesting to see where our little hiccups are to our ghrelin levels. So remember, when our ghrelin levels are growling, we're hungry. So usually people are hungry right around 8 a.m. and then noon and then 6 p.m., right? So we're kind of dictated by breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But if you stay up long enough, the midnight munchies, anyone? Yes, right? The longer you stay up and study, the more hungry you're gonna get, right? So you can't eat while you're sleeping, right? So people who find that you stress eat, usually in college, people call it like the college 15, right? But it's because people are staying up later. You don't have your parents telling you to go to bed or to like eat healthy food, right? And if you stay up longer, you're gonna start getting hungry again, right? Because our body needs sustenance if we are moving and we're working, right? Right. Okay, let me move to my next slide. Ooh, did I skip one? Okay, no. Okay, so we're gonna get a little bit more into the hypothalamus, or shall I say the hypothalamic center, right? So we know our hypothalamus is the janitor, but there's two little parts within our hypothalamus that contribute to our eating. It's called the lateral hypothalamus. The lateral hypothalamus brings on hunger. It destroys it and the animal will starve, right? So again, let's eat. So the lateral hypothalamus, it makes us hungry. So that part of the hypothalamus controls the eating, right? The ventromedial hypothalamus, it depresses hunger. So destroy it and the animal eats excessively, right? So if we mess with either or, you're either not going to be hungry at all or you're going to be too hungry, right? And this is also is connected to our thyroids, right? So people who have thyroid issues or thyroid imbalances, it affects our hunger and our hormones as well. Okay, so let's talk about the set point theory. So again, we're coming up with these theories. We're thinking of, how the hypothalamus kind of plays a role, right? And if we manipulate those parts of our hypothalamus, the lateral and the ventromedial, it alters our body's weight thermostat, predisposing us to keep our bodies at a steady weight. So if you've ever heard of, your set weight, your set point is the weight that you usually hover around. So for example, Sally, 5'8", usually hovers around 135. Maybe in the morning she weighs 133. Maybe in the afternoon she's 136, but when she wakes up again, she's 132, right? So we have these set weights that we hover around, right? And so if weight is lost and we go below our set point, our food intake increases and we get hungrier, right? Because we're trying to reach that balance that our body has made. So our set weight is our healthy weight that we kind of just hover around, right? And if weight is gained and we go above our set point, the opposite takes place, right? So again, our set point is our body's kind of average weight that we kind of fluctuate around, okay? And it's dictated by our lateral and our ventromedial hypothalamus, okay? So, and also when we think of medications and say that Sally is, say that Sally's in her 20s and she started taking a medication for depression, some medications do have symptoms that say weight gain possible. It's because it manipulates this part of your hypothalamus. So remember, anytime we put anything into our drug lord brain, there's ripple effects after, right, with chemical imbalances. So again, give and take, right? Give and take. That's why some medications cause people to gain weight or lose weight, right? Because it messes with these parts of our brain. And again, to continue with our set point theory, to maintain our set point, the body not only adjusts to our food intake and energy output, but it also adjusts our BMR, our basal metabolic rate, which is our body's resting rate of energy. So when it's dropping when less activity is occurring. So let me give you guys an example. Now that, and this could be happening to you guys at home, now that we're not moving around as much, so back, when I was teaching in a classroom, moving around, walking up and down to the staff room every day, right, constantly talking, moving around, I would eat little snacks throughout the day. Now that I'm just sitting and I'm not really giving as much energy out, I notice that I don't eat as much, right? My eating has gone down, but it's because of my difference of activity level over time, right? So if you become more active, you're going to have to eat more, right? So for example, when my fiance was doing, water polo in college, he had a $3,000 diet every day because he was working out 4 times a day, right? Because the energy expenditure was so much, right? But if you kind of stay, so like after this quarantine, right, a lot of people's energy levels are lower. And so maybe you guys notice like just going to the grocery store nowadays makes me tired, right? Because I have a different energy output. So anyway, interesting to think about, right? Interesting to think about. So the psychology of hunger, let's talk about it, right? Because clearly there has to be a psychological thing to hunger. So external incentives, things outside in our environment, right? We eat, okay, so we can eat simply by just seeing, we could be hungry by simply just seeing food. So we could be hungry by triggered by the presence of seeing one of our friends eating a really good meal, right? So let's talk about it. So we have a couple bullet points. Eating by the clock. We eat because it's time to eat lunch, dinner, breakfast. It's a societal thing, right? So we eat because of it's time to eat, right? Social eating. Eat at an event because you're expected to, right? Sometimes in some countries, if you're not eating their food, they take it as an offense, right? They're like, oh my God, you're not eating our food, right? So social norms play a role in our psychology of hunger. Stress and depression. People tend to either eat more or less of different types of food when they're stressed and depressed. So, you might hear of some people when they're depressed, they eat a lot. Some people, when they're depressed, they eat very little. Sometimes people crave really high carb and salty food, right, to make them feel better. So again, stress and depression, chemical imbalances, they affect, our hunger. Sometimes when people are super anxious for an upcoming interview, they lose their appetite, right? But there's also other eating cues like holidays and when we watch TV and, if anyone's ever watched Food Network when you're hungry, right? I always get hungry when I watch Food Network. And sometimes people just eat because they're bored, right? So again, there's many factors to the psychology of hunger and what triggers us to feel hungry or want to eat, right? So we also have taste preferences. We have our body chemistry and our environmental factors, nature and nurture, together influence not only when we feel hungry, but what we feel hungry for. And here's an example in Thailand, deep fried insects. Anyone? Does that sound interesting to anyone? Because I almost was like, right? But different cultures, right? And also, when I went to visit Europe, back before the world was ending and before I started teaching, in Europe, it was a part of their culture that they take extremely long lunch periods. Like they have like a 2 to 3 hour lunch during the day. And I'm like, what? Right? And also in Europe, they have long dinners. Apparently in America, we eat really quickly. So again, culture has a really, really big part of us as well when it comes to hunger and our eating habits. And so now we're going to switch over to the 2 disorders that fall under our hunger motivation lens today, okay? And we're also going to be going over this in abnormal psychology as well. So there's 2 types of eating disorders that or 3, I guess I should say, that fall under our an eating disorder, right? And so we have anorexia nervosa. A lot of people just call it anorexia. And this is when a person who is perceived to have a normal weight usually tends to be the audience of an adolescent females, tends to, not saying that men cannot have eating disorders, they do, it's just less common. And they lose dramatic amounts of weight continuously and they still feel overweight. Okay, so people who deal with or are working through their journey with anorexia, they tend to they don't eat. They tend to starve themselves. They tend to put themselves on 100-calorie diets, right? And remember, there's a lot of stereotypes with, this is their choice, but it is a mental illness. I want you guys to know that. It is not, they are not, if they were in the right mindset, they would not choose to do this, right? It is a cognitive disorder. Remember how A gets to B gets to C in our thought process. They have an irrational. There's something going on in their thought process that if they think if they eat that, then something bad is going to happen. They're going to gain all this weight, right? It's within our cognitive thought processes that there's something irrational happening, right? And so no matter how much weight they lose, right, they never feel like it's enough, right? And it also leads to body dysmorphia where they don't see what other people see in the mirror, right? So we have anorexia nervosa, and then we have bulimia nervosa. So anorexia is where you starve yourself and you don't eat anything to lose weight. And bulimia nervosa is the cognitive disorder where it's characterized by having episodes of overeating, which is what people usually call binging. Usually high calorie food, it's usually all the food that they don't allow themselves to eat. And then it's followed by vomiting or using laxatives, excessive exercise. So essentially, people who have bulimia, they eat a lot and then they go throw it up because it still gives them a sense of fullness because you're tricking your mind because of the hormones of ghrelin and all that are working. And it's a very, and again, not a choice, my people. Again, I want you to really, really think about a lot of people, there's a stereotype saying they choose to do this, right? It's a slow progression, my friends. It's a slow progression. So anorexia is where they again they don't eat and they starve and they still feel like they're not skinny enough. Bulimia, same thing. They tend to have big binging episodes where they eat a lot and then they throw up. And that leads us to binge eating, which is the vocab word that follows under bulimia, which is the reoccurring of binging and the type of purging that is known as bulimia. So again, two different types of eating disorders mostly affect women, but they still affect men. You will be watching an interesting little quick video of identical twins who both struggled with an eating disorder and how they fed off of each other. But again, remember, when we get into our abnormal unit, it's not as simple as a choice, okay? So I really want you guys to get that into your notes, okay? It's a irrational thought process that's happening, and that is why people who are categorized or diagnosed with a disorder, with this disorder, they tend to go to cognitive and behavioral therapy, CBT. Okay, CBT. And if anyone has more, interest or wanting to know more about this, a really good documentary is To the Bone by that Lily Collins stars in on Netflix. She does a really good job of showing the whole part of it and not just Hollywoodizing the illness. So. Okay, and just real quick, a quick summary of hunger before we stop this video and before we move on to our next one is just write 2 bullet points per. So biological, what's going on with our eating behavior? We have our hypothalamic centers that are affecting it, our stomach pains, our body's genetic set point, psychologically, just, watching the food channel, our mood, our, if we're, I don't know, some things that trigger us psychologically, right? Like our social clock of, it's time to eat breakfast, right? And then there's also the social cultural aspect of, taste preferences, learned cultural ideas, where maybe you value different meal times and different, food pairings, right? And again, social, cultural, psychological, and biological all come together with how this all is connecting to our eating behaviors. Okay, that's it for this one, and we're going to move on to our last little section of motivation before we start emotions.